All right, so welcome everybody to today's fourth speaker series event. This one is entitled Culture Against Climate Change, and we have with us today two speakers who are very familiar with both climate change and organizing around environmental issues. We have with us the Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr., the President and CEO of the Hip Hop Caucus, and Michael Leon Guerrero, the National Coordinator of the Our Power campaign. So I'm just going to say a few words about our speakers today, and then we're going to have each of the speakers talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session with our speakers. So think about some questions you might want to ask them as we go along today. And then after that, after we're done with the question and answer session around 5 o'clock, 5:05 or so, we'll end our discussion with them, and then we'll stay here and have a discussion amongst ourselves about some of the things that they've said, and that some of the things that the other speakers who have joined us in previous sessions have said as well. All right, so for over 10 years, Reverend Yearwood has worked as a minister and community activist and organizer. His early high-profile campaigns included serving as a political and grassroots director of Russell Simmons' Hip Hop Summit Action Network, and as the architect and implementer of 3 voter turnout campaigns: P. Diddy's Citizen Change, Jay-Z's Voice Your Change, and the AFL-CIO's Hip Hop Voices for the 2004 presidential election. The Hip Hop Caucus itself was formed in the fall of 2004 with the goal of sustaining the momentum of the voter mobilization campaigns and transforming that energy and engagement into other social and environmental justice campaigns. The following year, Hurricane Katrina laid bare the brutal intersection of racial, economic, and environmental injustice. In response, the Hip Hop Caucus formed the Gulf Coast Renewal Campaign, which organized the survivors of Hurricane Katrina and advocated for their rights. Since then, Hip Hop Caucus has been active in promoting participation among young people and people of color in the political process to work towards social change by harnessing the voice of famous musicians, artists, and other entertainers. Calling itself a civil and human rights organization for the 21st century, the caucus currently focuses on various civil and human rights campaigns and on environmental and climate justice programs. They have fought for clean water and air, for a just climate and energy policies, and against fossil fuels, recognizing that minority and poor communities bear the brunt of harmful environmental conditions. Our second speaker, Michael Leon Guerrero, joins us with over 2 decades of experience in environmental justice organizing. He worked for 17 years at the Southwest Organizing Project and Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. From 2004 to 2012, he was the national coordinator of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, immediately preceding Cindy Wiesner, our speaker from earlier this month, in that role. Before taking his current position with the Our Power campaign, Michael served as the executive director of Unity, an umbrella organization of national alliances that organize working-class communities of color in the U.S. He is currently the interim national coordinator of Our Power campaign. Part of the Climate Justice Alliance, the Our Power campaign supports community-led projects and programs that promote democratic, ecologically rooted economies as part of a larger radical transformation of the economy. In order to demonstrate how such transformation and transition is possible, the campaign supports 6 pilot communities across the country that center their models on zero waste, regional food systems, public transportation, clean community energy, efficient, affordable, and durable housing, and ecosystem restoration and stewardship. These communities are in San Antonio, Texas, Jackson, Mississippi, Eastern Kentucky, Black Mesa, Arizona, Detroit, and Richmond, California. They will show the possibilities of economies and life after what Our Power calls extreme energy. The Our Power campaign also advocates nationally against the dominance of extreme energy interests, especially in disproportionately impacted communities. So thank you both for being here today with us, to speak with us, and we look forward to hearing more about you, the work that you've done, and your programs and your organizational efforts, and what you're working for to achieve both social and environmental justice. So thank you very much. Reverend Yearwood, if you'd like to talk for 20 minutes, and then we'll pass it over to Michael Guerrero. Thank you.
No, well, thank you for having me. It's great to be there and here at the same time. So it's a wonderful improvement with technology. Um, Off the bat, first, the Hip Hop Caucus is excited to be a part of this conversation. If you probably noticed my hat, I hope that the University of Pittsburgh is rocking toward with the divestment movement, and I hope that they are pushing your board and to clean up your endowment. If not, I hope that is happening. I hope that is one of the first things. If nothing else we accomplish, is that it is very difficult for us to challenge the fossil fuel industry. That to me is a rogue corporation. And for me, having come through Hurricane Katrina, which this year will be the 10-year anniversary, actually August 29th will be the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Having lost loved ones in that storm, as well as those who have lost their lives in their livelihoods. But even more importantly, if there was no Hurricane Katrina, there would still be my home state of Louisiana, would still be this place called Cancer Alley. And so it would be important that we would still deal with the water runoffs and the smog and the pollution. So it would still have children getting asthma and bronchitis and emphysema, and our grandmothers having heat stroke and cancer. So regardless of that, we feel that it is for institutions that are pushing for the greater good of civilization and the renewal of civilization through education. It is juxtaposed to have these organizations to be benefiting and profiting from the same thing that can actually hurt civilization. So we would hope that those of you, faculty and staff and students, or in the community, you would be on the forefront of making sure that we can clean up our portfolios and endowments, and really move that process forward. It has been done before. It's not new. We've done it with cigarettes. We've done it with apartheid. It is actually very important. It's important because of the fact of the matter that history has shown that when you are benefiting from bad things usually don't do well for you. For example, the University of Rochester, as an example, in the 1970s, had the third largest endowment behind Harvard and then the University of Texas, and then they had University of Rochester. There was a company in Rochester that was called Kodak. It was two things that was going on with Kodak at the time. One, there was our generation at that time. In other words, the generation of like you were telling them that there would be this thing called computers, and we wouldn't be in phones, and we wouldn't be using photos like we need to, and so we should transition in that aspect. But also, Kodak was also involved with the apartheid movement. They were the ones who took the pictures through Polaroids that had that had people wear the name badges in South Africa. So the students were requesting the school to divest. Well, they did not divest. But as Kodak crashed, so did the endowment at the University of Rochester crashed as well. And so now their endowment is now one of the 50th largest endowments, but they have lost so much simply because they would not listen to the students and they would not listen to those who are fighting for humanity. So that's a little brief kind of intro into that. So I just would hope that you are on the forefront of that movement and engaging. As it was said, I am the president of the Hip Hop Caucus. We are engaged. We are a multi-issue human and civil rights organization. So we do a number of things. You heard we do voter engagement. One of our campaigns in that area is called Respect My Vote, which is used to encourage ex-felons to come to the polls. And we use a lot of celebrities to do that process. We do a lot as far as fighting against torture. We are very engaged with our foreign policy. While there's a lot of Hip Hop Caucus components and some of our artists there in Pittsburgh, one of our great artists there is Desiri X from Pittsburgh, who's a great brother, and Paradise Gray, who's with X Clan, I know is out of Pittsburgh, but there's so many others who are there in that great city and around that community. So we are excited about that aspect of the process. We just released in regards to our process around climate change. We've been engaged in this issue since Hurricane Katrina for the past 10 years at a very high level and really trying to break down the silos within the environmental movement. One of the silos being that when we were engaging in this process, we would notice we would go to the green rallies and it would be mostly just people who were white. Now, I'm fortunate that Dr. Beverly Wright from Louisiana is one of the foremost environmental justice advocates, raised me. So I kind of knew that there were other folks who were involved in that issue. And you, Michael, will get into that as well, who were part of the EJ movement, and also Dr. Ben from the hip hop community. So I knew there were different faces. But when you came to the rallies, it sometimes didn't look like that. So we wanted to break down those silos in that process and have been engaging in this movement at a very high level. And so we're very excited to be able to deal with many issues that I will go into and victories that we were a part of. Before I get into that, we actually launched an album last year. I don't know if you can see this. Let me see it. Hold this up here. So let me hold it back. Yeah, I can tighten it up. This is the hard part. This is the good part. So we actually released this album here called the album Home, in which we actually released a climate change album. And on the album, we have Common and Neo and El Varner and Raheem Devon and Carmen and Malik Youssef. And all these folks here released a climate album last year, which is very exciting. You can get the album if you go to iTunes at iTunes/home. That's important because that was something we knew we needed. We know we needed a beat, so to speak, or a soundtrack for the climate movement. It's very important to also reach other communities who are affected by the catastrophe of the climate or who are dealing with climate justice, particularly low-income neighborhoods and communities of color who are disproportionately burdened by pollution and health risks. We wanted to engage them, and we knew that using one's culture expression can connect them to their political experience. So that album, the album Home, was done by my dear brother Malik Youssef, who is a 5-time Grammy Award winner, been nominated 15 times for Grammys. He is the producer for Kanye West. And so he helped produce that album with Neo and Common and others. And so I hope that you will get that. I will kind of say that it's been a little disappointing. We launched an album in December, and the album does have majority of people of color, from the brown community, from the Black community. And so we were excited, but we haven't seen the kind of robust movement and the climate movement when they even have these artists. They've always asked for people of color to be part of the movement. They've always asked for artists to be engaged in the movement. But sometimes it seemed like they were only asking them to regurgitate their talking points. So it's exciting. We were excited to have artists who want to be a part of the movement. But now when they're part of the movement, we haven't seen the excitement on the other side to engage with them. So it's, I would hope that many of you will download the album or engage in that regard and be happy that we have these kind of artists that are a part of this process. So as I get into my spiel here, I would hope that you also have read the article that I did with the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy. We actually just released an article at the beginning of Black History Month. Me and the EPA Administrator did an article called Climate Justice, A Fight for Equal Opportunity that came out actually on Rosa Parks Day, which is February 4th. We released that article to discuss the issues of climate justice and equal opportunity. And we kind of connected the dots regarding this is the 50th anniversary of Selma and how that climate change is a civil rights issue. So I would hope that you would all grab that article and maybe kind of speed read if you want to ask me any questions on that process. But I've done a number of articles, and one of those that I get into what I think should be known about the movement. And I will say this though, as I give my presentation, I don't discuss the movement as a siloed movement. I don't discuss the movement as, okay, this is the Black climate movement or the white climate movement. There are issues, and we have issues within diversity within the movement, but I discuss this as a movement regarding us fighting for our planet and us fighting for humanity. This is a very serious time. for us. As we discussed in the civil rights movement, they were fighting for equality, fighting for us to be able to drink from the same water fountains or to go to the same hotels. The difference between that movement and our movement today, while there are still issues of equality that we are dealing with in our communities, in our country, the difference is now regarding climate change. We are now dealing with not just equality, but also existence. So that means that if we don't get this right now in the 21st century, by the time we get to the 22nd century, by the time we get to 2115, and I don't know if any of us in that room or in this room will be here in 2115, unless you get some really good drugs. And if you do, hit me up, let me know. but but if that's not the case, then we're fighting for the next generation, and it's very serious, so that they can have clean air and clean water. And what we also see is that even our own communities have different types of air and different types of water that they drink, depending on where they live, and if they are communities that are the path of least resistance. And so that's not right. That should not be the case. And so we are fighting to create that change in this process. So one of the things there as we fight for existence and equality in the 21st century, one of the things in the civil rights movement is that they had what they call their lunch counter. I don't know if you know what the lunch counter was, but in fact, it was for students from North Carolina A&T, a small black college in North Carolina. Now, actually, now a large black college, now a university. But at the time, for students who wanted to sit at the lunch counter, recognized that our country could do better. And in doing and wanting to do better, these four young freshmen and one sophomore, I believe, went down to the lunch counter at the Woolworth's counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And they sat down at that lunch counter and demanded to be served. Now, that spawned an amazing uprising from students all over this country, not just black, but black and white, brown and yellow, male and female, uprising to demand that we could desegregate our lunch counter in that process. Well, in the 21st century, with climate change, we have our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. We are dealing with an issue that if we don't rise up as young people, as people of color, as male, as female, as straight or gay, as theist or atheist, as humanity, not Republican or Democrat, but simply humans, if we don't rise up to fight for our lunch counter moment for the 21st century and transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, transition from oil and coal and gas to wind and solar. If we don't transition, then it will have huge ramifications in regards to the next generation. One of the things that I always like to think about is how Dr. King would speak about, how we are free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Talk about how we can come together. And it's amazing now that I'm here in Washington, D.C., just a few miles, a few blocks from President Obama, the first African American to sit in the White House. So we can see that we can reach free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. But now we sit, as you sit there and I sit here, we recognize that now we're no longer just dealing with that, but we are hoping for a new generation that can transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And they can one day say, fossil free at last, fossil free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are fossil free at last. And so we've had some amazing wins for our movement. And let me just kind of go through those, and then we can then have a further dialogue about what we can do to increase the wins, not only for our movement, but also bring more people of color into the process. So the first thing is yesterday, President Obama vetoed the Keystone XL Pipeline. And that is something that that's good news. That's right. And that made my day. Anytime you get arrested for something and are thrown in jail for something, you are happy when it happens. And when it doesn't happen, you're just not as excited. So I was excited to see that the Keystone XL Pipeline We have a long way to go to, we had the veto, now we want the reject. My friend Van Jones, when we first started this movement, said that it was a done deal. It couldn't be done. It was when that myself and Bill McKibben, who were organizing for the Forward on Climate rally in Washington, D.C., that we were wasting our time. But we weren't wasting our time, because I know, and he knows this too, but we know that organized people beat organized money every single time, as long as we organize people. And so what we saw with the Keystone XL pipeline is that done deal became an undone deal. And the president, who was already going to sign it, vetoed it yesterday because of you, and all of us around this country. Because of that momentum as well, we had the People's Climate March last year, which we gathered almost 500,000 people in the streets of New York City last year, in an amazing process, in which also we put indigenous communities and frontline communities at the front of the march and at the back of the march. And so that was very important for our movement in that regard. But also, even more important, the next day, there were actions called Flood Wall Street in that process, in which we were challenging Wall Street in regards to this climate movement. And that was very important as we talk about divestment. We are recognizing that we must hit them, but they will continue to put profits before people. And so we have to have that connection. One of the other things that was important for our movement last year, that we were a part of, was that we were part of the New York coalition that helped to ban fracking. That was an amazing achievement, and it was the first state that actually has gas in their state that went forth and banned fracking. That was very important, because that wasn't a movement that was really supported by the climate movement. It was just folks who were affected by fracking and understood the dangerous natures of what it meant to be polluted and the health concerns. And so we were a part of that process in regards to banning fracking in New York. Along with that, we were also part of the movement to fight the fracking infrastructure and gas exports. We're still fighting that movement in regards to, not too far from me in Maryland, something called the Cove Point. It's a Cove Point facility in which they want to export liquid natural gas around the globe and to China. But also, again, the concerns about Cove Point and other areas is that it caused just such health damaging in that process. Another win that we had some great wins in 2014, and we continue, was that we were stopping the coal exports in the West. So we still have no West Coast coal exports, in which we were organizing, and young folks were literally putting their bodies on the line, standing in front, going down to where the coal plants were, putting their bodies on the line in that regard. And this was also part of the Keystone movement, young folks organizing in that process, even more so coalitions in solidarity, the Cowboy Indian Alliance and other folks coming together around this country. Not too far from you, we had the Seneca Lake gas storage. Again, almost 200 arrests, mostly young people, going up there to Seneca Lake in New York, stopping that and pushing forth against that, as well as young folks battling in regards to stopping the Federal Energy Reserve Commission, telling FERC that this must stop. What does all this mean? All this action, young folks stopping, again, this being their lunch counter moment, from stopping fracking in New York to going to stopping coal exports in the West. What this means is that there is a new generation that is rising. And that's so important, because right now there are some old folks in this movement who are old. And I'm just sorry to say that, but they don't understand how important this movement is for a new generation, and how important it is for us to galvanize and organize to come together. And so they've done things their way. They've had Earth Day, they've come, and there's nothing against that, but they've done it. But the one thing that they have missed, that what they have done Earth Day, and they've done things in the past, that they cannot see that, wow, we're doing these rallies, we're doing these mobilizations, but it's mostly a tree-hugging Birkenstock white rally and movement. and they don't feel discomforted by that. What I can say though is that young folk like you get uncomfortable. You're like, my goodness, is this nothing but white people in this rally? And how can this be at a rally about the climate and about climate justice? And it's just people who look like me. And anybody, we're not engaging. So the most powerful thing about 2014 that young people came together and said that we must desegregate the climate movement if we are truly going to change the course that we are on. That's one of the most powerful. Now, we're not there yet, but that is one of the things that you are beginning to see from this new generation, that they are not comfortable with just the status quo leading them in this process. And so where we sit now going to 2015, where we are now, is that if we are to engage new communities, to have them at the table, and what's so important is that urban communities know that you are either at the table or you are on the menu. There is no in between. And for too long, urban communities, Black communities, brown communities have been on the menu when it comes to the environment and climate change. And so I'm so excited to see young folks coming up today to change that process. We can have a menu and a piece that goes forth. But the next thing we must recognize, and I'll close with this, so I would love to have the questions, is that we must change and shape policy. Either we shape policy or policy will continue to shape us. The current carbon rule and the current carbon power plant rules that are coming out, pre-existing power plants and new power plant rule that is coming out, that has been put forth by EPA, is also one of the most important things that we will be dealing with in 2015, as well as going steamrolling towards Paris. But we must be at the forefront of shaping that policy and working with EPA and the states, wherever we are, to make sure that these carbon rules are as strong as they need to be, as well as reinforcing the Clean Air Act and everything else that we need to put forth as far as protections and protecting EPA itself from those who want to destroy that institution. We are truly at our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. Now, you were born for this moment, and if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? We are at a moment now that in 2115, if they see this tape of this recording from the University of Pittsburgh and from what's going on now, they may wonder why it was so. They might think this is some ancient-looking stuff we used back then, at that time. Like, my goodness, what were they doing? They can just beam us into the room. But hopefully, if they are around in 2115 and they have clean air and clean water, then you will have succeeded in our quest to protect our planet. If they are not around, or this world is so radically different, and we're simply having wars not for oil, but having wars for clean water, then we would have failed. This is our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. This is not a game at all. And this is our time to use our simple existence to create change, so that when the next generation does rise up, they will say that we are fossil free at last, fossil free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are fossil free at last. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reverend Yearwood. Now we'll pass it over to Michael and Guerrero, who will speak again for another about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions for both of our speakers.
Do I really need to go now? Reverend, that was excellent as always. Great to see you again, and it's an honor to see you and be part of the conversation with you. So very nice to see you all. Jackie, I don't know if you're still there in the back of the room, but thanks again for inviting me and all of you there at the University of Pittsburgh. It's a little bit cloudy and cold here in Albuquerque, but probably not as cold as it is out there in the East Coast or in Pittsburgh and the Midwest. But definitely want to thank you again for being here. I'll start just by maybe giving a little bit of background as kind of what brought me to this place and how I'm speaking to you today. So personally, I'm a Pacific Islander. I'm living in the desert now, but my family's from the island of Guam, and we're in the region of the Pacific, which is in the northwestern region, about 2,000 islands. That the largest of which my family is from, called the island of Guam. That's 8 miles by 32. So just to give you an idea of the scale of where our people come from. All the other islands are much smaller than that and are at risk very soon, several of them, of disappearing. And even before they're at risk of going underwater, there are a number of effects related to climate change in terms of the loss of water, drinkable water, coral reefs that sustain our islands, and the ecosystems that sustain our islands, and then of course our people and our cultures and our heritage. So for me personally, there's quite a bit at stake in this moment. As Reverend Yearwood said, this is a very serious moment, definitely for my people there. I've actually been an organizer, community organizer, primarily for going on the last 30 years. So I'm one of those old folks that that's been in this movement for a long time. But I spent 17 years doing grassroots community-based organizing, going back to the late 1980s when the environmental justice movement really started to grow and to flourish. And there were a number of community-led struggles that really led to the emergence of what was a really powerful movement for many years of communities that were living in the shadow of polluting industries throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. And so a lot of my work was doing work here in the state of New Mexico, primarily with communities that were being poisoned by different types of facilities, particle board plants, and military toxics facilities. And then later, as the high-tech and computer industry started to develop here in the Southwest, we started working more and more actually with workers in those plants that were being severely poisoned because the practices and regulations of those industries were so poor. So we had many workers that were literally working barehanded with toxic chemicals like TCEs and solvents and other things. Many women that were having birth defects, huge cancer clusters. In fact, here in Albuquerque now, there are class action lawsuits that are being started because of birth defects that happened back in the 1980s and 90s from that toxic pollution. And so, anyway, so that's been a lot of my work. And then as the movement grew, I also got involved a lot in the regional development of networks, primarily here in the Southwest. But there were many, and Reverend Yearwood referred to a lot of folks and different organizations that were part of this movement, basically calling for the accountability of the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce regulations in our communities, and then later other federal government agencies and state agencies, because we were finding that the protection of our communities, it was disproportionately, we were underrepresented in terms of those protections, and we were proportionally underrepresented even in those agencies. So I think even at the EPA, there were two people of color working at the EPA at that time, the absolute worst of all federal agencies at that time. And so that definitely had implications in terms of the protection of our communities. So the movement was actually very powerful and resulted in a lot of policy changes so that environmental justice now is a really key aspect. But that's being rolled back. And what Reverend Yearwood said about the Clean Power Plan and being able to protect policies as well as shape policies that will protect us is really important. And I'll say a little bit more about that later because we're in this moment where regulation is being rolled back in a time when we need it even more. And then just to kind of end in terms of my trajectory, then I got involved in the global justice movement. This is actually where I met Jackie, because we were finding that a lot of the laws that were protecting us, the local laws, the state laws, national laws, were actually being undermined by international trade agreements. Like the WTO, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and others that basically made environmental regulations, protections of workers illegal under those trade agreements. And there was a very undemocratic process, and it was a way to roll back the gains of social movements for many years to be able to protect our communities and achieve independence and all of those kind of things and sovereignty. And so these trade agreements were ways to roll those back. So we had to also not only think globally and act locally, but we found at that time we also had to act globally as well. And so there were a lot of international networks and movements that started to emerge during that time and came together at the battle in Seattle in 1999, and then through the World Social Forum process. The organization that I work for, the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and I know Cindy presented to you earlier, was set up as a mechanism for grassroots organizations, people of color organizations in the United States that didn't have capacity to engage at the international level. GGJ became the vehicle for us to meet our counterparts worldwide that were doing this work and fighting these trade agreements and other global policies that were undermining our communities. So I'm getting over a cold, so I'll pause every now and then. So anyway, but what was interesting about the global justice movement, right around and within the last decade, there started to be a shift. And the shift was that it was no longer just about the trade agreements and these big international institutions like WTO and trade agreements. They started to shift towards climate. And the reason why is because now climate policy at the international level, basically you have corporations and you have banks that are seeing the same picture that we're seeing, meaning my organization, the Climate Justice Alliance, and many others in the climate movement, that the economic system and the climate crisis are linked, right? In other words, the global system, economic system is contributing to the climate crisis because global capitalism on the trajectory that's on right now, the planet cannot sustain the level of production and consumption and extraction and exploitation of the planet that is happening. So we were seeing all these international social movements of farm workers and farmers, peasants, people throughout the world that were being displaced because of global economic policies, but also because of climate change, because of flooding, droughts, all of those kind of things. And so more and more those movements started to turn their attention to climate change policy. So I'm going to shift back a little bit now to where I'm at today, working with the Climate Justice Alliance and the Our Power campaign. So coming out of this whole history of these environmental justice movements and what we now often refer to as frontline communities, because there are many now, not only in communities of color, but you've got communities like in Eastern Kentucky dealing with the effects of coal mining. You've got a number of communities now facing the effects of fracking. So, communities now that are living with these pipelines like Keystone XL, and there are many other proposals that are basically pushing this fossil fuel development through their communities. So many communities now are at risk, and we refer to them as frontline communities. So for us, but we also see that the resolution and the way to change to save the planet is also in the economy. It's rooted in the economy. And how do we change our economic systems? How do we have an economy that's not based on extraction and exploitation of the planet and people? How do we develop an economy that's based on a local living economy that sustains life and heals the planet? So that's what our campaign is about. And so we started 2 years ago, the Climate Justice Alliance, which now has roughly 40 organizations. Half of those are locally and state-based organizations that have been working on environmental justice and frontline struggles for many years. There's 14 networks that range from city-based all the way to international alliances like Grassroots Global Justice and the Indigenous Environmental Network, and then a number of support organizations that provide policy support, communications, and other things. And the basic premise of this alliance is how do we transition and create a just transition to a local living economy, and also how do we lift up the voices of our communities to be leadership, to be at the table, as Reverend Yearwood said, in the broader climate movement. So, for instance, we were very involved in the planning and organizing of the People's Climate March in this last year as well, because we also saw that if this was going to be a march at the scale that people were projecting, And even though people, interesting story, 2 weeks before the march even started, the projections were it wasn't going to be anywhere near the scale of what people thought. It was going to be 100,000 people, maybe, when we did the numbers, and we ended up with nearly 500,000, as Reverend Yearwood said. But if it was going to be that significant, and if we were talking about representing a broad people's movement in the United States, there's no way that that could have happened if the leadership of people of color and low-income communities and frontline communities were not at the forefront of that. And so it was a very deliberate political decision that was negotiated to have indigenous communities, to have frontline communities, domestic workers, urban communities, rural communities represented at the front of the march. And 40,000 people in that first section were from those communities. And I think that was a huge statement, because it demonstrated that this is a movement that is growing, that is broad, that it crosses sectors, that it represents really what a movement in the United States needs to look like for us to address climate or any other issue. So, so that was a huge victory in and of itself. So for us, but the work then continues both at the ground level and as well as a national level. So People's Climate March is still in conversations now. There's an organizing committee that's still thinking about what's next, right? There are a lot of activities that are now being planned around the country. The commemoration of Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, the March on Selma, the Voting Rights Act. There are a lot of things that are happening that are in motion now in 2015 that that can all start to come together now. The whole movement around Black Lives Matter, and we're seeing this coming together. And the Hip Hop Caucus is playing a really key role in bringing together a lot of these different efforts as well. So you're seeing a lot of this weaving of conversations and a lot of breaking down of these silos and fragmentation, like Reverend Yearwood said, which is a really huge and important development. And then as we lead into Paris for at the end of next year, it's going to be a critical fight, right? And one of the things that the People's Climate March did was that it opened up political space. It opened up political space for victories to happen. So, you know, there was a lot of organizing work that went on for many years for Keystone XL and a number of the fights that Reverend Yearwood mentioned, and many other local campaigns, the fracking ban in New York. But the march opened up that political space because it demonstrated that there is a mass movement. And I think that allowed for more boldness and opportunity for good decisions to start to be made. So now leading into Paris, it's that same, there's some hope, even though there's not a lot of optimism about the agreement that can come out of Paris, but that there's an opportunity to actually push for bolder action as we get there. So social movements around the world are starting to mobilize for this. In Paris, they're planning big actions and mobilizations throughout the year. There's discussions at the People's Climate March level about what can we do here in the U.S., and they're talking about pilgrimages throughout Europe. There are many, many things that are going to be happening and taking place around that. So, but going back to the economy and why this is why it's important for us to look at this, because there is a difference in vision and perspective around how, even though corporations and banks are looking at the same picture and saying, yes, the climate crisis and the economic crisis are linked, they're seeing it in a much different way. They're seeing it in a way for how can we create new markets, how can we commodify nature, how can we commodify air, create trading schemes and new markets that are going to allow for the current economic system to continue, not taking into account what the capacity is for the planet to sustain these different things. So when we get into some of these policy issues, like the Clean Power Plan, for instance, a lot of what we're going to be hearing about is things like cap and trade, right? Which for environmental justice communities is a huge fight, because what that means is that it allows for corporations to be able to continue polluting at their current location, but they can offset that pollution by buying forests in Latin America and from indigenous communities, because those trees that they'll own at that point will take out as much carbon as they're polluting in Richmond, California, as they're polluting in San Antonio, Texas, in the Gulf Coast, et cetera. So this is why we're seeing a lot of social movements and environmental justice communities in the Clean Power Plan fights and in other things that are going to be fighting this. And one of the major demands of the movement is going to be around protecting those regulations that are going to allow for the protection of communities surrounding these plants. because when we talk about frontline communities, they're going to be the most at risk and continue to be the most at risk for these health and environmental problems. At the same time, the CPP depending on how the implementation is done, could also undermine opportunities for a just transition. In other words, for instance, in the state of Kentucky, they just passed a law, the state legislature, that said whatever that comes out of the Clean Power Plan, the state of Kentucky is not allowed to use any less coal than what we're using right now. Right. In other words, so they've already set the baseline that there's not going to be any chance of reduction of coal power use in the state of Kentucky. So there's going to be fights in all 50 states about how this gets implemented. And there are also a lot of false solutions that are going to be tied to that. So they're going to allow nuclear energy, natural gas and fracking, biomass incineration as alternatives, as acceptable alternatives to using fossil fuel and coal and oil. And so these are some of the things that are going to come up in terms of fights around the Clean Power Plan as we move forward, that we need to be engaged in at the community level, at the state level, and the federal level, because it has everything to do not only with the protection of our lives and our communities now, but also has to do with how we're going to shape our future and how we're going to rebuild our communities in ways that sustain life and heal the planet. So anyway, so just to give you that, and then that fight is just going to be carried on to the international level as well. So I know there's a lot to try to offer in a short time, and we want to have time for questions. And I was also asked to say a little bit about what people can do. And I think Reverend Yearwood said it really eloquently. I think this is a project of our generations, right? Mine and yours and the one to come. That this is a turning point, and we all need to be engaged in it. We all need to continue to build a broad and powerful grassroots movement that's going to demand the accountability of our leaders and carry forward the vision that we want for our communities. So it's going to take a lot of creativity. And I don't know what your majors are there, but we're going to need a lot of support also in rebuilding our communities and building up different sectors of the economy that are going to be sustainable and be healthy. And we can always talk more about that as well. And so definitely also join the Divest movement. We want to encourage you to support that, and yes, and join us in being part of this movement. And I'm sure there'll be many announcements that we'll pass on to your class about different actions and activities that will happen going towards the end of the year. So thank you very much.
Thank you again, both very much for what you said, and hopefully a lot of you have gotten a lot out of it. There was a lot there, but I thought it was great. So if you have any questions, if you feel comfortable, and I hope you do, if you wouldn't mind just coming up and sit at the front here so that you can make sure that you're on camera and that they can hear you. Feel free to start the discussion. Anybody have any thoughts or any particular things that stood out to them about what either of the speakers said today? Sarah. Really, you shouldn't be afraid. They're friendly people. Right?
Hi guys, thank you so much for your talks. They were excellent. So I was thinking a lot about the title of our event. We called it Culture Against Climate Change. And I think that it speaks a lot to the fact that we can use culture, like we're talking about hip hop, and to talk about climate change. But I was also thinking about how there's something about culture and in being eco-friendly. Like when I went to France, I realized that it was very within the culture of the French people to be very big on recycling. Lights in all, I went to a school there, all of the lights were like time or like movement sensitive, so they were always off if, in hallways that weren't being used. That was in apartments, and that was also in the college. I don't know, I just noticed that it was very ingrained in the culture, and I noticed that that's not the case here whatsoever. And I wonder what you guys think about that as tackling that as a problem. The fact, how can we make it part of our culture, part of our just day-to-day lives, to think about conserving and all the other things that are important in the environmental movement.
So either of you can go ahead, and answer that one.
Yeah. Well, I can say a few words to kick it off. I think it is definitely culture, and I think when we think about culture, I think you're right. It oftentimes, and I think this is to the detriment of our movement, is that we think of culture, it's kind of layered on or an afterthought, right? And I think this is where what's one of the things that's great about the Hip Hop Caucus is that it's very much integrated into the movement building and organizing work. And then there's that deeper level of just culture and how we live, what lifestyles, all of those kind of things. I think part of the challenge has been is that here in the United States, when we've talked about environment and how to deal with the ecology and all those kind of things, it has actually focused more on that kind of personal responsibility, right? That it's turn off your lights and recycle and all those kind of things, which is important, right? But on the other hand, in our communities, for instance, people, we talk about we recycle all the time, right? But we don't, a lot of these practices are done just because out of necessity, and and not wasting and all those kind of things. So in some ways, there is this cultural divide that it's like, well, that's what this white hippie culture tells us to do all of those kind of things. But what's not addressed enough is those structural issues and problems that and the issues of race and class and all those kind of things that are part of that. So I think that's part of the cultural divide that we need to overcome, is that both of those things are important. And because definitely in our communities we're also consumers too, right? But so we have to figure out how to do that and creative ways to do that, so it's not seen as something separate, but it's actually something that becomes ingrained in how we build our communities. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's a great question. The only thing I would just add to that would be that it's there are two things. There's culture, as you're right for labeling it as culture, and I think, but it's also lifestyle, which is very similar. I mean, culture is a lifestyle, but it's really a lifestyle, and culture can help create the lifestyle that we're talking about. And so I think the key thing there is that, and you're right. I've been to other countries, and they do. You see it across the board and how they are approaching climate change. That's why mainstreaming the movement is so important. Sometimes in our movement, we have a tendency, because we're right and we think that's enough. Like, that's just it. Well, we know that, there's global warming, or we know we should recycle, or we know we should do a composting, or we know these kind of issues. And unfortunately, we stop there. And that's where culture comes in at. Culture moves it from being just right to being the way. Like, this is the way we do this. It's like, as I'm from the South, so being from the South, it's nothing for me to open a door or to hold the door open. That's just it's just the way it is from the South. And so for me, it's a lifestyle, but it's also the way it's supposed to be. So I think that the more that we can make our movement more mainstream, and I understand that means, I'm not trying to create that term, like, let's mainstream our movement. What I mean by mainstream, making it so that our movement is much more known by more people as a way of life. Then I think that more people can be a part. But in saying that, I think that being sustainable can also be very expensive for certain communities. So when we say being organic or being sustainable, certain communities, that's not that easy. And so when we say, let's go to Whole Foods, for some, Whole Foods means whole paycheck. so we don't want to just, it's when we create that lifestyle, we need to also create ways that is a just and fair lifestyle for those who might not have the same economic status to be a part of that, and it doesn't become a burden. And certain communities have always been, environmentally conscious, but they just need to understand that when we deal with them or deal with in the process, is dealt with understanding where they are in their part of the struggle in their life. But we just don't just bring them into our movement or our struggle and say, wow, they're not where we are, but we appreciate what they bring to the movement.
Thank you. Other questions? Take maybe one or two, and then take them together. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Laura. Thank you for coming, and thanks for being here, kind of.
I'm there. I'm there. We there.
Okay, yeah, you're here. I first wanted to respond to you guys. We do have a divestment movement, Fossil Free Pit. We have a coalition of like 12-ish clubs right now on campus, and we participated in Global Day of Divestment along with some community like groups based in the larger Pittsburgh area, and that is moving. So just so you know, don't worry, we're on it. And so you guys all know too, Fossil Free Pit. And okay, so my question is, you guys are both community organizers. You've been community organizers for a long time. You're like engaged in all these networks of community organization on like global and local scales. So kind of like, but you talked about, one of you talked about kind of the political space that the climate march in September created. And kind of what I notice sometimes is this break between kind of like the community organizing world and like the political world. And sometimes sometimes I'm like, wow, all the good people went into community organizing. Not to, I mean, like that, like it's like hard to, it's like the systems are so different. And so kind of like, I was wondering, how do you interact with that different system, and like how do you kind of institutionalize and like kind of change the dialogue between this kind of like world of community organizing and the world of political space, and like if this community organizing has made political space, then like how do they translate over?
That's a great question. That's a great question, and I can, I'll relate it to my other world that I operate in with the Black Lives Matter. Where Hip Hop Caucus is very much involved with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that movement is struggling to work with the institutions are part of the civil rights movement, and sometimes they're not connecting as they need to connect. Partly because, what you were kind of getting to, I think is so important. You noticed is that, and this could be sometimes referenced as the inside the Beltway. They sometimes call it Washington D.C. or sometimes the institutions. A lot of the institutions have become institutionalized, and that's another word there. They are trying to keep their doors open, and that's real. This is not, and what we need. Let me say, preface by saying we need institutions. Not that we don't need institutions. We need institutions. Institutions are critical for our work, for continuity, for making sure we can continue things on, for resources, for research, for infrastructure. Institutions are viable and are needed for our work. But when institutions become at odds with, in essence, when institutions become at odds with the streets, and the streets and the suites aren't seeing eye to eye, there is a huge problem. So when you see this huge mobilization within the streets, within the activists, within students, divest movements, whatever, and you're not seeing that connected with institutions or at odds, it is a big problem. It is a huge problem. Now, part of that problem actually goes into a deeper round, of which goes into the funding of institutions. That there is this nonprofit, sometimes it's a nonprofit industrial complex, in which foundations are funding institutions, and that also forces them into a certain lane. They can't go outside of that lane. That actually creates a silo. So you wonder why this institution is only working on this one issue when right next door to that issue is this, and they're not doing it because they don't want to have mission drift. And then when they go to the streets of this movement, they're vibrant, they're organizing, but they don't have the structure or the resources. And so you have these at odds components. So your question is correct. And we're seeing that, but one in the Black Lives Matter movement and also within the divestment movement particularly. We're seeing that a lot within the divestment movement, in which the overall environmental movement is not coming in line with all the energy of the students around the country, as well as the EJ movement. And there's this kind of this marginalizing of the environmental justice movement in which the green groups will say, hey, we can do that work. We'll hire one person of color, give us the resources, and then we'll then give that money to certain groups. And it becomes very much a very, not a good structure. I'll just leave it like that. But let me just say this to what you're saying. I think that that's being broken down. I think that because we're holding accountable institutions, and there are good folks in institutions who recognize the deficiencies. And so what you're now seeing, that breakdown, in other words, these great mobilizations in the streets, and then we're not connecting that to what's happening as far as policy sometimes, that is being broken down. We could do a much better job at that overall, but it is being broken down. But that's a phenomenal question you asked. It's one of the things that actually hurts, and it is the thing that hurts the movement because they're not being as transparent sometimes in dealing with that. So I applaud you very much on asking that question. A lot of folks just come out, they want to be engaged, they just want to they want to make change in the world, and then I recognize that even within our own movement, that to make the car run correctly, it needs a tune-up. And so now you need to change the oil, change the belts, change the fans, change the seats if need be, but you need to change the car to get to your destination. If you don't do that, then you will break down. And so your question is very important, and an important one at this time, as the streets and the suites can sometimes be at odds.
Yeah. No, that's right on. I think that's both the question and then your response, Reverend. Well, two quick things. One is that there, along with the divest movement, there's also an invest movement. And so we're working with 350.org and a project and other groups and even some foundations and institutions about where does that money then get reinvested to. And we're looking at creating different financial institutions that can reinvest back in communities for just transition work. So I also wanted to encourage you to link up with that as well. But yeah, the question really amazing, and I think in the climate movement in particular, that it was really stark, right? In fact, there was a letter that came out 2009 by the it was called One Sky, big national coalition of national organizations, unions, and others that came together to pass climate change, comprehensive climate change legislation. Now that President Obama was in office, and obviously it failed, running into the brick wall of the Republicans and the Tea Party movement and all of those kind of things. And the letter was actually an open acknowledgement saying that where we failed was that we spent too much of our time on beltway strategies and not on building the grassroots movement that needed to move real policy and legislation. So this was a public letter that they put out acknowledging that. And so you'll see starting 2009, there started to be a shift where you saw more of that grassroots movement and the emergence of groups like 350.org, and even some shifts within those national organizations. So what Reverend Yearwood said about some of that changing and breaking down at the national level, and some of these groups like Sierra Club, Greenpeace, they're much more intentional in terms of how they're trying to relate to communities and grassroots strategies. Now, it's not always the same in the local level, right? So we still getting our fights at the local level because not everybody's gotten the message, but still that's really important, and it's really fundamental for us to be able to break that down because we need both. We do need to be able to engage at that political level. We do need beltway strategies, but they've got to be connected to overall movement strategies and what's happening on the streets.
Okay, if somebody has a quick question, I think we could ask it, or does anybody have anything quick to do? One last thing. Yeah, sure. Yeah. I hope you don't mind just one last question, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great.
All right, thanks for talking to us. My name is Ben from the sociology department here. Reverend Yearwood, you talked about this is our lunch counter moment. And thinking about how, as you mentioned, the lunch counter moment in the 60s came from a lunch counter action, right? And those students who took that action, it wasn't as though the lunch counter itself was the only thing about segregation that infuriated them, right? That was a strategic target they picked. And it was a good strategic target that galvanized people and it turned a movement into a mass movement in civil rights. Thinking about this being our lunch counter moment, I was wondering what your take was, both of your takes on what our lunch counter action is.
That's a great question. It is our lunch kind of moment for the 21st. It is without a doubt. And I'm glad Michael mentioned the invest because there is a divest invest side. I would think that would be one of the ones there, because the fossil fuel industry is based upon their money. Their whole industry is based upon what they can extract from our planet and profit from that. And literally, they're basing their money on what they will extract at some point in time, which is why, the Keystone Pipeline is not just about a pipeline, about keeping those tar sands in the ground in Alberta, Canada, as well as keeping the coal in the ground in Kentucky, or keeping whatever in the ground wherever it needs to be. And we just use what we need to use, which is our wind and solar and other great renewables. So I think that to me is our forefront, because I think if we hit them in the pocket, and I think you can do that. I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear divest Pitt in that regard. But I do think that is one area that we need to deal with to hold those people accountable. And I'll say this. I think this is my last piece, probably to say. I'm not sure, but I do want to say this: that part of that lunch counter is that it means that you recognize that you're willing to put your body against the gears of the machine to grind it to a halt. I take that very seriously, because I don't sit here, I know what that means. And so once you do that, I know that literally that means you're sacrificing everything in some cases to bring justice. And so, in some people, I know they've already given their lives in this movement, either directly or indirectly. And so, I know as you're sitting there in the classroom space, I taught at Georgetown, so I know what it means to teach. Also knows what it means to be a student, obviously. So I know what it means to give up everything and to be sitting where you are. So I take that lunch counter moment piece very seriously. I know what that means, that you're putting everything on the line. But the alternative is not what we can have. There is the alternative of where we sit now, means that the next generation doesn't live. So, I know that some of you in that classroom are going to be like, man, I'm out of here, man. They crazy. I'm not, and that's fine. And there's some of you who will put your bodies against the gears of the machine and grind it to a halt. And all I can say to you is, for the next generation, is thank you. Thank you, because there are a generation that they haven't born yet. And those that are born, that are right next to power plants and coal-fired power plants, who are suffering from asthma, and they will say thank you. Let me just say this as I close. I say this story about a young girl that I had to bury. She had asthma, and her mother had to decide between literally paying for her asthma medicine or taking care of the other children in the house. The entire time I was doing that funeral, that girl, her mother lost that Russian roulette game. The entire time I was doing that funeral, her mother was trying to climb into the casket. Literally was knocking it over an occasion. People were trying to drag her away. And she was saying, she just was poor. And this was a young girl who should have been, was one who was just, should have been there with you at the University of Pittsburgh. She was just brilliant and smart. But because of folks who just really designed to just put her life on the line because of their profits, that's wrong, man. And so, if we as humans don't stop that, then ain't nothing going to move us. So I just want you to know that this is our lunch kind of moment. But I do know that as humans, we can stop the madness. And I know that together we can do it. So thank you for that. But we got no choice but to stop the madness, and stop it right now.
Well, well, I'm not at liberty to fully answer that question at this time. I'm just kidding. Well, just to say, first of all, so the civil rights organizers during the 60s, 70s, 50s, 40s there were some pretty damn good organizers, right? And they knew how to do actions that both took into account the circumstances, the timing, all of those kind of things that would galvanize movement, right? And that's a hard thing to do. And sometimes you just don't know. I mean, even Occupy, it ended up being a big moment when they did Occupied Wall Street, but I don't think they ever had a sense of the scale and the impact that would have. There are different groups that have done Actions 350 and the White House activity. I think they had a good sense of what the impact could be. Even the battle in Seattle too. I don't think people realized what the impact would be. So it's a hard thing to really know when is that moment, what's that activity that's going to create and help to galvanize movement like that. But I think what's interesting about this moment is that there are opportunities for that to happen, and we're seeing a lot more of these galvanizing moments. And I think that has to do a lot with just the times, right? I mean, the economic conditions that we're living in right now, the severe weather, and the racism historically that's continued to affect our communities, and now the police repression and brutality in our communities. A lot of that stuff's just coming to a head right now. And so it's creating a lot more opportunities for people to galvanize and build movement around. So I think it's a matter of just being engaged as part of it, being engaged in the struggle and being in communications with people and being part of building movement. And also I'd say, as probably my closing message is really be engaged with your community, right? Because a lot of part of the challenge is how do we take this conversation to our communities? And there's a lot of work to be done in white middle class communities that have been involved in the environmental movement for a long time. But there's ways to build bridges with communities of color that don't necessarily mean that you have to come and work in our communities. It means that there's work that can be done in yours to be part of the movement and be part of the conversation and be part of these galvanizing moments. So I guess that's the last message I'd leave for you. There's definitely plenty of work that we can all do together and do it in parallel. But as long as we're communicating and weaving our efforts together, I think we'll build a powerful movement.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. That was an excellent segue.